Hi there. I'm afraid it's just the two of us at the moment. I'll give it a few more minutes and then we'll start. Is it Alois or Aloiche?
It's Alois, Alois.
Alois. Wonderful. Lovely
Yeah,
to meet you.
nice meeting you too, brother.
As I say, I've asked Spencer at Harbinger to just send out an email just reminding people that this is on, just in case people have forgotten. But we will progress anyway, just in case. And I'm recording it as well, so if people need to see the recording, they can have that as well.
It's okay, brother. Yeah, yeah, that's good.
Okay. Okay. Well, Alois, it is just going to be the two of us for now, I think. But I've asked Spencer to pick up with with the others. Just send an email around just to confirm the link and just in case people are struggling to join. But I will start and I will record the session as I say, so that those of you who are watching this back can get the full experience. So let's share my slides. There we go. Okay. So in this session, I'm going to be talking a bit more about Wittgenstein's relevance to today. How can he be of use today? Oh, I've just realized one thing I'm going to do is share screen slightly differently. So because I do have a video that will play, so I'm going to share sound that way. It will work better. Oh no, where are we? 2 seconds. Share sound and share. There we go. Okay, well, let's try. Let's try. Okay. Not sure what happened there. Fingers crossed it's going to work. Okay. As I say, so this session is going to be looking at Wittgenstein's relevance to debates today. We'll be looking at specific problems that arise in contemporary discussions of religion. Some of these will be familiar to you. Some of them might not be so familiar. Those of you familiar with philosophy of religion in general will be fairly familiar with things like the problem of evil and the questions about the existence of God and so on. And Wittgenstein has some really interesting approaches to these sorts of problems. And I'll also talk about perhaps the most famous academic who attacks religious belief or critiques religious belief, and that is Richard Dawkins. I will talk a little bit about him. He recently debated a friend of mine on the question of whether or not religion speaks a historical truth. And I'm going to look at why that whole approach that he takes, I think, is mistaken, and why Wittgenstein shows that it's a mistake. So he certainly did a good job of, I think, Wittgenstein, of responding to critics of religion in his own time. There were lots of people who would be speaking against religious belief in the time of Wittgenstein. It was perhaps sort of the early days of people starting to develop proper analytic objections to the existence of God or to issues around the problem of evil and so on. And Wittgenstein has specific responses that he offers there. And I'm going to touch upon some of those, but there are what we call now the four horsemen of atheism. These are the philosophers and scientists who argue that religion is a bad thing and that it's dangerous to modern society. And I'm going to argue that those arguments that are made are often misplaced for reasons that Wittgenstein makes clear. And I'm going to suggest that Wittgenstein's arguments continue to hold up, not just against the critics of his day, not just against some of the people who I've mentioned here, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, some of whom have already died, and many of whom are thinking of retirement and of stepping down. But there is still this kind of modern movement of people who are critical of religion. And I'm going to argue that Wittgenstein's criticisms still hold up today. And then we will also consider the extent to which Wittgenstein's views on religion are in fact religious. I know that some of you are already aware that we've already explored that one particular question. Is Wittgenstein describing religion, or is he describing a kind of philosophical spiritualism? So one very famous atheist who became a theist, which is unusual. He became a theist around 2008, and there was a book that was published called How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. Well, I'm going to argue that Anthony Flew, as he was called, never really changed his mind. He was an evidentialist. He believed that there was no evidence for God, and then he believed that there was evidence for God. I would argue that makes him very consistent, that he didn't really change his position. He simply changed where he drew the line. He thought the scales went one way, and then he said the scales went the other, but he never questioned the scales themselves. So I would debate whether or not he was actually someone who changed his mind. But Anthony Flew said that it's better to presume atheism than theism. And he said, what I want to examine is the contention that the debate about the existence of God should properly begin from the presumption of atheism, presumption that God does not exist, that the onus of proof must lie upon the theist. And he says the word atheism ought to be understood not positively, but negatively. In this interpretation, by the way, that means, what he means there is the word atheism ought to be understood not positively, but negatively. The atheist is essentially making a positive, not a negative claim, sorry, not a positive claim. So he's not someone who positively asserts the non-existence of God, but someone who is simply not a theist. So for instance, atheism literally means not theism. And what he's saying is the better way to define it is, unless you've proven that I should be a theist, I am an atheist. That's what he's saying. So he's saying is, if I'm not a theist, then I am an atheist. And that's where everyone should be, unless they've proven that they should be a theist. So as you probably are aware, there are many people who try and prove that you should be a theist. And there are many people who try and prove you should be an atheist. What Anthony Flew is saying is, until we've got a proof one way or the other, we should be atheists. We shouldn't be theists unless we've got absolute proof that there is a God. Now, I'm going to argue that this is a mistake in a very fundamental way. So I want to throw out the scales. I don't want to say that the scales are actually this way or this way, that one side is higher than the other. I want to argue that the whole system of determining the existence of God is a mistake. But before I do, let me first prove that God doesn't exist and why that doesn't matter at all. So I'm going to argue that God does not exist, but that it doesn't matter that God doesn't exist. That even if you're religious, it should make no difference to you whether or not God exists. Existence is not a relevant feature of God. So look, for instance, on the right-hand side of the screen here, you've got things that exist. And these things include anti-clockwise screws. They include things like hair shirts. They include lunch boxes with The Simpsons on them. They include camera lenses and 3 different Cambridges. And I'm sure there are many, many more Cambridges in the world. It includes border terrier puppies. It includes holes. Some philosophers have argued that holes exist. So the hole in the middle of a donut. Does the hole in the middle of the donut exist, or is it the absence of donut? Oh, hi there. I'm gonna mute your microphone just because I'm not sure if you're intending to be on speaker. Sorry, I'll just mute it. Sorry, Techno. If you need to speak, please do unmute. You're welcome to do so, but I'm just going to hit mute for now. As you can tell, there's not too many people present, so I'm recording this more than I am teaching this at the moment. But please, 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 Alois and Techno, whatever your real name, please do come in at any point and ask any questions. Just unmute your microphones and feel free to speak at any time. With such a small group, it's absolutely fine to interrupt me at any point. So my argument would be that this question about what exists, should it include God? And some people might say yes, and then cross it out, and then say, well, no, actually, I will add God. And then say, no, maybe I shouldn't add God. And then, yeah, will I go? And then just basically give up. Because one of the issues that we've got here is that you've got theists arguing that God exists, you've got atheists arguing that God does not exist. But in both cases, there's this focus on God and existence. And this might surprise many of you, but there are many things which are absolutely certain and absolutely valuable, which do not exist. I'll give you some examples later, but existence really isn't all it's cracked up to be. I think I said last time that existence in some way trivializes the thing that we're talking about, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But the idea that something exists, the existence of mammoths doesn't give me any religious validity. It doesn't make me believe in God or make me find anything profound about life. I think it's wonderful. I love the fact that mammoths existed, or that the existence of mammoths could be a thing is a wonderful thing. But I don't care one way or the other in terms of, it doesn't give any religious significance. So adding God to this, wouldn't God just become an alien, just another existing person, another being who has more power than me? Sure, but it's just a thing. So my point is, I don't want to see God on this list. I don't think it makes God any more religiously significant to make sure that he's on this list. Things that exist are not more important. Arguably, things that exist are less important. So let me explain what I mean by that in a moment. But first, coming into a discussion of this, so we might say, I have this question about the nature of God, and I will say something like this, that there is a theory that we can put all existence in terms of possible worlds. What we mean by that is, if something is possible, then it exists. It doesn't necessarily exist in this world, because if it existed in this world, it would be actual. But if it exists in another world that isn't this one, and by world we mean all of existence. So it's kind of, if you've ever seen shows about parallel universes, that's what we're talking about here. Imagine a parallel universe in which I'm French and I have a fish on my head. So I speak French and I have a fish sitting on my head. That is possible. It could happen. And therefore, according to David Lewis, a philosopher, it therefore must exist somewhere. It must exist as another world. It's not this world, because I'm sitting here right now and there's no fish on my head and I'm not speaking French. But in order for the words, it is possible that I speak French and have a fish on my head, if that sentence makes sense, if it's logical to utter that sentence, in the way that, for instance, if I said there is a five-sided square, that doesn't make sense. There is no such thing as a five-sided square. It wouldn't be a square if it had five sides. It would be a pentagram, right? Or no, a pentagon, sorry. It would be a pentagon if it had five sides. But it would be a hexagon with six, and so on, and so on, and so on. So the idea here is that possibilities, in order to have their reality, because in some ways it makes sense. If someone zips past me on a bike and I say, you could have killed me, I mean that in a substantive sense. I don't mean it in the sense that, you know, there could be wizards and witches. I mean that literally you could have killed me. And the reason that those words have weight, the reason they mean something, is because just like if someone did kill someone, I said, you killed someone with your bike. Those words have meaning because they describe a reality. David Lewis says, we're already committed to the idea, therefore, that sentences describe reality. So when I say there could be, I don't know, I could have six fingers, that's logically possible. So there must be a world in which it exists, because I'm using the words and they mean something, so they describe something. Now, I don't believe any of that's true, by the way. David Lewis is not a philosopher I agree with on many things. But interestingly, we don't need to agree with what he has to say in order for my following argument to work. What I mean by that is, if possible worlds are possible, i.e., if David Lewis's notion of possible worlds even makes sense, if you can imagine that there are different worlds where different things happen, then all I need to ask you is this question. Could a possible world exist that was not created by God. Right? This is all I have to do. Could a possible world exist that was not created by God? And that creates a dilemma for someone who wants to argue that God exists and that God created the world as, like in a standard act of creation. Firstly, if they answer yes, then it would be damning for those who exist in that world. Imagine being in that world. Imagine being someone who is in a world that wasn't created by God. If you're a theist, presumably that would worry you, the possibility that there are people who don't have God. Secondly, we could be that world. It would justify lots of the arguments that people have made that evil happens and therefore it's God can't possibly exist. It would justify it if we said, well, maybe we're the world that was created without God. So the point here is, if it's possible that a world could exist that wasn't created by God, you can't really answer yes and hold on to your faith. Equally, you can't answer no, because if you answer no, then what you're saying is it is impossible for there to be a world that was not created by God. That any world that exists must have been created by God. Any universe that exists must have had God in it and must have been brought about by God. But if you argue that, do you remember my point about squares having 4 sides, not 5? Well, you're going to have to, I can prove that squares have to have 4 sides. It's part of what it means to be a square to have 4 sides. You now have to prove to me why it's part of what it means for there to be a universe that it must have a God that created it. And there have been arguments similar to that. David Hume, for instance, who is often listed as an atheist, even though he was not. He was what's called a deist. He believed that God must exist, but we can't say anything about God. But David Hume said, there must have been some first cause. The universe must have got started somehow. That starting of the universe doesn't necessarily imply that it has to be God, just because that might make logical sense to us now. So you might say, well, I can prove to you that every sequence of events has to have a first event. I don't know if that's true, by the way, but let's assume it's true. Like, we can assume that squares have 4 sides. But even if so, that's not a proof that I can be a religious believer. It just proves that there must have been a first cause. It doesn't prove what the first cause was. In short, what I'm saying is, if you think it is possible that a world could exist that was not created by God, then you've damned the inhabitants of that world, which could include us. If you answer no, it's not possible that a world could have existed that wasn't created by God. It's not possible for that to happen. God must have created any universe that exists. Then you've got to now prove to me why it's logically necessary that that's the case. So my point here is, possible worlds talk, even if it's nonsense, even if it's silliness, can still be used as a really effective proof that God probably therefore doesn't exist, or rather cannot exist. Or at least I can't claim that God exists. Remember, I don't care that God doesn't exist. Even if I was religious, and I'd like to think I have at least a religious approach to the world, like Wittgenstein. I may not be a religious man, but I view problems from a religious point of view. I do think religion is worth defending. I do think that religion is important, but I don't think the existence of God is important. The existence of God, I think God is important, but not the existence of God. So my point here is, I can undermine this argument fundamentally just by pointing out that there are many things that don't have to exist in order to be meaningful. The best example, the numbers that you just saw dropping down, those were numbers. K represents a number. But numbers are incredibly hard concepts, right? 2 plus 2 necessarily equals 4. There is no possible world in which that's not the case. That does follow, right? We have to assume that 2 plus 2 equals 4 if we assume base 10 in every possible world. But what I mean by that is, numbers are certain. I can have faith in numbers and it will never run out. No one can ever tell me that numbers don't mean anything. And yet, if someone told me that numbers don't exist, I couldn't care less. It wouldn't make any difference to me. The number 8, whether it exists or not, is so irrelevant to me that it doesn't mean I didn't have an 8th birthday. It doesn't mean that if I go into a shop and they give me the wrong change, that I can be mollified by someone saying, oh, don't worry, numbers don't exist. So numbers may not exist, but they are eternally significant. Remember the point before that the very first thing we did in the very first session was look at Kierkegaard saying God does not exist. That makes Kierkegaard an atheist, but he's a Christian. So how can he be an atheist? Because to be an atheist just means you deny the existence of God. And he says God does not exist. He is eternal. So numbers don't exist. They are eternal. Also can be true. And numbers, no one doubts the existence of numbers, or rather, sorry, that's a silly thing to say. So no one questions numbers and their reality. No one questions their meaningfulness. No one questions them as concepts. No one questions that they mean something and that they're not made up by us. Likewise, we could say the same thing about God. So my point here is you can easily prove or disprove God. And I think it's too easy, in fact. It's very easy to prove or disprove God. In fact, Kant said you can prove and disprove God, but it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't achieve anything because ultimately, he says, the fact that you can prove and disprove God means that proof here is irrelevant. He was just one step away from saying, therefore, it doesn't matter about existence. His existence is irrelevant. The reason why you're seeing here in front of you this interesting outline, this is Spinoza's God, Deus, the Latin for God, Deus central here. And what he's saying, what Spinoza is saying, is all of these things are God. Everything is God. Because what he's saying is the universe itself as a whole is God, because everything is the fulfillment of some eternal truth. Everything is the expression of the universe itself. And the universe finds expression through what he will call God. Now, we might not want to go that far. We might not want to embrace his philosophy. But my point is, he didn't care about the existence of God. God is existence. He is not, God does not exist. He is existence. And existence is eternal. So again, here you have Spinoza, who was religious. He was Jewish, but he was then excommunicated and then became a Christian, and then he was excommunicated again. But Spinoza was profoundly religious and yet delivers an account of religion which doesn't involve God existing. That was one of the reasons he was excommunicated. Likewise, Kierkegaard can be a Christian and still deny the existence of God. And I think it's philosophers who are to blame for this. It's philosophers who have debated it, like Antony Flew, have debated the existence of God. And that debate is a waste of people's time. Existence is irrelevant here. It would be like debating the existence of the number 2. Do you want to do that? Because I don't. I have no interest in debating the existence of the number 2. I'll just continue using the number 2. Okay, so I want to show this is a Wittgensteinian approach to just undermining the entire debate, to showing that theists and atheists can both be wrong because they're both obsessed with existence when they shouldn't be. You will notice one thing about church. They don't talk about the existence of God. They don't talk about God in that way. God's existence isn't something that's up for debate. God is assumed and God is part of our form of life. It's part of our expression of what it means to live. So again, like the rain dance, why are we assuming that Christians have to make the claim that God exists, even if they do? Because inevitably, if someone comes up to you and says, does God exist? As a Christian, you want to say, yes, of course. But the truth is, you might say, well, I don't care. I believe in God. I don't care if God exists like the chair exists or like donuts exist. I would rather God was like numbers, eternal, meaningful, conceptual, hard, certain, meaningful, all of these sorts of things. That's what I want God to be. I don't want God to be uncertain, contingent, some stuff. This is why I said making God exist is actually detrimental, because it makes God like anything else in the world. He's just another thing. I don't want God to be just another thing. Numbers aren't just another thing. Numbers are infinite. Numbers are never change. Numbers are special in a way, in a slightly different way to God, but they're still special in a similar way. Okay. But what about specific beliefs that people might hold? So here's another quote from Antony Flew, who says, "The news of the immortality of my soul would be of no more concern to me than the news of my appendix would be preserved eternally in a bottle, What do we mean? Well, we mean literally his appendix in a bottle. What he's saying is, if I was to have my appendix out and it was put in a bottle, that would not be me. And equally, he's saying, if my soul goes to some other place when I die, so what? Why would I care? Why would that be of any interest to me whatsoever? It would be like if someone said, well, we're keeping your hair and we'll preserve it forever in ice. And you say, well, so what? It's not me. So I'm no more my appendix than I am my soul. This is the argument that Antony Flew makes. I recently read a paper in which, about Islam. And in Islam, there is a debate about whether or not the soul is individual or not. What that means is my soul different from your soul? Notice the similarity with numbers, by the way. How many number 2s are there? How many number 6s are there? Right? There's one number 6, but it applies universally. Likewise, is the idea of a soul universal? Because the idea of one's reaching perfection or perfection of oneself, well, that's the same for everyone. So wouldn't it mean that once everyone achieves perfection, once everyone achieves a kind of grace that enables them to enter into an afterlife, wouldn't that mean that all the souls are indistinguishable from each other? Why would it be me? Why wouldn't it just be the same as the other souls that other people have? Anyway, my point here is simply to say, this is a cynical view of what immortality of the soul looks like. And here, Wittgenstein would be interesting. Unlike in the other debate where he would say, Antony Flew is just as mistaken as someone who argues that God should exist, because Antony Flew says God does not exist initially, and then he says God does exist. But Wittgenstein would say both positions are wrong. Just because one is the opposite of the other does not mean it's true. If I said, I don't know, apples are the best food, that can be false. And if I said apples are the worst food, you wouldn't say, well, oh, that must be true then, right? So just because something is opposite doesn't mean that it has to be correct if the opposite is incorrect. So the point is, saying one thing is false doesn't make the other thing true. This isn't a P or not P situation. This isn't it's either Tuesday or it's not. This is either apples are the best food or they're the worst food. It's like, no, why are you giving, that's what's called a false dichotomy. So atheism and theism are seen to be a dichotomy. Either God exists or he doesn't exist. And Wittgenstein says, no, there is a third option. Existence is irrelevant. Or rather, you could say, okay, God doesn't exist, but I don't care. So again, we could just adopt one side and say we don't care. With this, it's slightly different, because what we're saying is a specific belief in the immortality of the soul, if what it means is that my soul, whatever that might be, continues on after me. If it's not me, then it's not me continuing on. If it is me, then what's this? What am I right now? Am I my soul now as well? And if so, why do I need my body? So all sorts of questions get created by that dichotomy. But again, we might be given a false choice here. Why assume that these are the only choices? So Flew is saying that there is nothing profound or meaningful, not anything religiously meaningful, in the idea of living longer. You know, life's problems are not quantitative, they're qualitative. Right? Problems in life are not, if only I'd made £10 more money, or if only I'd managed to beat the computer at solitaire one more time, or if only I'd delivered one more lecture, then life would have been meaningful. That's never the case. Our life is never made more meaningful by having more of it. There might be one exception. You might need enough of a life that you can live a full life. Kierkegaard makes this point. Kierkegaard says, a child that dies young doesn't get the opportunity to fully investigate their life, to question their life, to question their existence. And there's a case to be made for that. Okay. But his point there is there's a certain threshold where you've had enough life that your life can be meaningful. But what makes it meaningful is not the fact that you've had that much life. Another way to put this is to ask this question that Wittgenstein asked, where he said, what answers come from having more life? Or in another point, he says, the answers to the problems of time and space must be found outside of time and space. If what I do is pointless because I'm ultimately going to die, and you know, the futility of existence and all these things that existentialists talk about, in order to give my life meaning, I'll have to look outside my life, outside the world. This is what this interesting diagram is reflecting, this idea that you can think about the meaning in an atom, but very hard, hence why it's grayed out, because it's nothing at the atomic level has meaning to itself. Only when you get human beings do you get a sense of meaning. But then you can have group meaning, then you can have community meaning, you can have planetary meaning, you can have universal meaning, and you can have divine meaning. But the point is, once you've reached the divine, you've stepped outside of the universe. And that's what he talks about when he's talking about viewing your life from outside of time and space, viewing your life what he calls sub speciae aeternitatis. And I think there is grounds for believing this found in scripture as well. In Luke 17:21, he says, "Nor will people say, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is,' because the kingdom of God is in your midst." What he means by that, as we assume, is what he's saying is heaven isn't a geographical location. You can't sat nav your way to heaven. It's not a place, or it doesn't, and there's no time that passes there. Heaven is right now. Just as I was talking about before, the idea of praying for something in the future. There's a mistake there, because again, why can't the prayer itself be an expression of religious meaning, of grief that the world is the way it is? Meaning, the meaning is now. The meaning is here and now. Equally, that seems to be what's coming out in Luke's gospel, is this idea that the kingdom of God, heaven, grace, is to be found right now. And it has to be found right now, but only by stepping outside of the here and now. But it isn't a later here and now. Otherwise, it would just be more here and now, right? So nor will people say, you know, here it is or there it is. So Wittgenstein says that in sort of kind of opposed to the idea of flu, but similarly sort of agreeing with flu, he says the temporal immortality of the human soul, that is to say, its eternal survival after death, is not only in no way guaranteed, meaning if it was the idea that my soul goes to heaven, then that's a conjecture, that's a contingency, that's something that could be true, and it's also something that might not be. But this assumption, he says, in the first place, will not do for us what we've always tried to make it do. He says, is a riddle solved by the fact that I survive forever? So I'm imagining myself going to heaven right now. And I think, oh, well, presumably I'll know if Wittgenstein was right. I'll get the truth of Wittgenstein's philosophy. I'll get the truth of all the questions of existence that I've been asking as a philosopher, or even just as a human being, as a husband, as a man, as a son, as a weak and feeble person. I will get all of these questions will be solved. I don't even know what the questions are, but how can they be solved? I wouldn't know what it would look like for them to be solved. So he says, is this eternal life not just as enigmatic as our present one? If the future life that I'm supposed to have after I die is the same as this one, then presumably I bring all the problems along with me as well. So he says the solution of the riddles of life in space and time lies outside space and time. And this is, again, this point about moving outside of a temporal view of the world, moving outside of a mundane, contingent view of the world, towards an eternal view of the world. Notice here, he seems to agree with Flew to start with. He's saying to Flew, you're absolutely right. Your soul living forever is no more significant than your appendix being preserved in a jar. But there is another thing that's possible, which is that was never what was being promised by religion. What religion offers is that you can your meaning can be found outside of that temporal viewpoint, outside of space and time. I can adopt a view sub speciae aeternitatis, from the auspices of eternity, or from the point of view of eternity. And by doing so, my life gains meaning. There's another conversation that Wittgenstein had much later in his life where he said, suppose someone asked you about belief in immortality, and suppose the form of the question was, what's in it? Or is there anything in it? Meaning, is there anything in belief in immortality? Or is there anything to the idea of belief in immortality? And he said, the idea that the study of philosophy should be able to show you what's in it. Wittgenstein would have said that this was a fundamental misunderstanding, a misunderstanding of belief in immortality especially. The point here being, if you think that philosophy can disclose an answer to this question of what it means to think of one's life as going on, as being more than this life that we find here, the idea that you could use philosophy to disclose to someone what its value is absurd. It's a misunderstanding of the very belief that we're trying to make sense of. Notice again, a little bit like the rain dance and all the other examples that we've had, where our interpretation of behaviors, of beliefs, of rituals are fundamentally at odds with the rituals themselves, with the beliefs themselves. Here, we're trying to understand belief in immortality, and maybe you believe in immortality. Maybe you have a belief in an afterlife. I'm sure many of you do. I suspect all of you do have a belief in an afterlife. But what Wittgenstein is suggesting to you is that's not necessarily what you mean when you express a belief in immortality. It's not that you believe that there's a really good pitch here, and this is a really, really beneficial package, that religion is a great way to get this stuff. This stuff being an afterlife. You'll get more life if you just do this. Little bit like vitamin drinks. That someone would say, oh, believe in God because it will get you an afterlife. Drink this drink because it will extend your life. The idea that they would be similarly presented like that is absurd. It's a fundamental misunderstanding. And what Wittgenstein is suggesting is maybe the better way to understand one's immortality is through the eyes of eternity. So what he means by that is, again, like the idea of him leaving everything as it is, he doesn't want to change your beliefs. He wants to hold up a mirror and say, this is really what a belief looks like. So again, the rain dance was a misinterpretation because it took certain facts and misrepresented them. The fact that the dance was done during the rainy season, for instance. And again, just because you're doing the dance, people who do the rain dances now might think that they do them because they want the rain to fall, because it's a very intoxicating interpretation. It's an interpretation that overtakes the belief itself. And suddenly we now believe that that's really the reason why we do it, when the truth is, that's not why we do it. And so just as we have with the rain dance, this misinterpretation of belief in immortality, Wittgenstein is saying, maybe we can do the same thing with belief in an afterlife. So the point he would say is, rather than relative value, and I'm mentioning this for a reason because it leads into my next problem, just as we can speak of the relative value of immortality, this idea of where does the evidence take us, or this idea of it's worth it, I will commit to religion because I'll get an afterlife, and that's worth it, right? That's the wrong way to think. Because that makes it relative. Like if the existence of God, God's existence is like the existence of my phone or the existence of hamsters. If God's existence is just to be an existing thing like everything else that exists, that makes him relative to everything. He might still be bigger and better and more powerful, but he's still just bigger or better than more powerful than a hamster. He's not bigger or more impressive than everything that exists. And that's what we want to say. And in order to make him other than that relative contingent value, we have to speak about absolute value. So what the point here is now, is immortality, is my soul a way of understanding the absolute value of my life? Meaning, if someone asks you to sell your soul, notice there is often a conversation had, like Faust selling his soul. I think Bart Simpson sells his soul to Millhouse, for instance, that kind of thing. The idea of selling one's soul. It's not like selling something else. It is all of yourself. It is not like selling your house and your car or your family even, which would still be a relative value to oneself. It's selling you. I mean, maybe even selling your family would be selling your soul, right? So The absolute value we're talking about here is not like the value that we find in objects in the world. It's outside of space and time. It's an eternal, my life is eternally meaningful. This moment now that I'm experiencing with you is forever, because either it's the only time I'm going to do it or it's every time I'm going to do it. So the point being, this is now fundamentally valuable to me. And there's lots of philosophers that make this point, by the way, not all of them religious, or at least not all of them within a church. I would say, however, and this again comes back to our question about, is Wittgenstein really religious, or is he talking about spiritualism? If Nietzsche, who calls himself the Antichrist, can have this viewpoint, then surely it can't really be religious. Well, I don't know about that, because I think there's enough to be found in the Bible, in the Gospels, for instance, and the fact that Jesus was a Jew, to suggest that he didn't really think of the afterlife as more life, that rather he thought of the afterlife as this life viewed eternally. That's why your actions matter now, because whatever you do now is the only time you get to do them. You will never get another life to live. The whole point is that's what gives them weight. That's what gives them significance. You may not be sold on that idea, but the point is that's what Wittgenstein's position would be. And notice the alternative is a debate where we say, does the afterlife exist or does it not exist? Just like the debate, does God exist? Does God not exist? And here again, we found Wittgenstein cutting in between those two debates, just like cutting a third way between them and saying, I don't care about the existence of God one way or the other. I don't care about the existence of heaven or hell. I don't care about the existence of that kind of thing. That's all relative and contingent and mundane and trivial. I'm interested in the religious significance we can attach to these beliefs. And the religiously significant aspect of these beliefs is that they are forever, that they have an eternal significance. Okay. So turning to Dawkins now, let's look at this broader objection that he has to religion. So Dawkins, a scientist, he says not only is science corrosive to religion, he says religion is corrosive to science. It teaches people to be satisfied with trivial, supernatural non-explanations and blinds them to the wonderful real explanations that we have within our grasp. It teaches them to accept authority, revelation, faith, instead of always insisting on evidence. So notice here, he says we must always insist on evidence. This is the only thing we should be doing when it comes to making claims about the world. I would argue what Dawkins has said is in part true if we accept what he thinks religion is the only thing that religion can be. If he's right in saying that religion is a belief in trivial supernatural non-explanations, then I will capitulate and I will say, okay, if religion is a belief in trivial non-explanations, then it's definitely false. But that's not my definition of religion. That's his definition of religion. My definition, or rather what I think that defines, is superstition. I think what he's defining there is a superstitious belief. Trivial, supernatural non-explanations are the definition of a belief in magic and superstitious beliefs like crossing one's fingers to keep one safe, or like I said before, believing in God only because that's a way of staying protected, like joining the mob, right? Which would make, again, belief trivial, because your survival, believe it or not, is trivial. It's just a fact. It's just one of those things that happens in the world. There's nothing religiously significant about the idea of your existence or what you think or what you believe or where you go. These are all trivial. What gives them their meaning and their value, as I've argued a moment ago, is this Wittgensteinian notion. And again, this is not limited to Wittgenstein. Many people think this. It's the eternal significance of these beliefs. So notice, he says it teaches people to, if I said it teaches people to be satisfied with absolute religious attitudes that bind them to the wonderful world that we live in, that's a definition of religion I can get on board with. So Dawkins basically turns religion into something that everyone would reject, or most people would reject, and then rejects it, which is his mistake, because religion is not what he thinks it is. He's trivializing religion and then saying it's trivial. I would argue that many people trivialize religion, but only through a mistake, through misinterpreting what religion really is. So I don't want to linger on the arguments that Richard Dawkins makes for two important reasons. One, there aren't actually many arguments at all. He doesn't really make arguments anyway. He's not a philosopher. That's the other reason. Dawkins is not a philosopher, certainly not a good one. He's a very poor philosopher if he's a philosopher at all. His arguments are very weak. For instance, he makes one argument, which is that because the world could exist by accident, remember my point about possible worlds? Is there a possible world that could exist that was created not by God? He says, yes, there is a possible world that exists that couldn't have been created not by God. It's this one, he says. But the problem is, he says it's this one, and that's a leap. You can't go from it could be the case that P to it is the case that P. This is what we call a modal slip, a slip of modality. He thinks that that possibility proves actuality, but it's not. It's the other way around. Actuality proves possibility. If I actually hold up two fingers, then it must be possible for me to hold up two fingers. But if I say, using one hand, I will now hold up six fingers, oh, I can't. So because it's impossible for me to do that on one hand, in which case the impossibility proves it can't be actual. But again, it doesn't follow that because something is possible, I am now going to hold up three fingers and then I hold up four, right? Well, it was possible that I held up three, but I didn't. I held up four. Maybe you could argue you held up 3 plus 1, whatever. My point is, just because something is possible doesn't mean that it actually has to happen. That's a really terrible argument. If one of my undergraduates made that argument, I wouldn't, I would be telling them off, put it that way. Richard Dawkins is doing this in a published book. That's not good. So he's not a good philosopher, and so we don't have to spend time looking at his philosophical arguments. But one thing that I would like us to look at is an argument he made in front of children at a faith school. Ooh. Okay, it's not working. Apologies. I will make sure the video works when I share it next time. But in a discussion that he has with a student, Richard Dawkins debates the student, and he says something along the lines of, human beings evolved. And the student says, well, actually, according to the Quran, they didn't. They were created by God. And he says, so you believe that because it was the first thing you heard, which is absolutely not what that student said. He misinterprets what the student says, well, or rather deliberately misinterprets what the student says. The student actually said, when I read the Quran, I see the right thing. Interestingly, Dawkins then goes on to say, okay, so you're saying that the Quran provides stronger evidence of belief in God, or sorry, stronger evidence in favor of creation than science has provided in favor of evolution. And the student sort of scratches his head and he's not really sure. He doesn't really think that the sacred texts are stronger evidence. He thinks they're just the only evidence that he should look at. And one thing I want to suggest here is that I think Richard Dawkins has misunderstood the student so badly, he hasn't even attempted to try and understand him. He's made a mistake between relative truth and absolute truth. So to give you a quick example, there's a relative claim. So Godmanchester is a town near here. It's a small village, actually it's quite a large village. It's a town, in fact, just down the road from Cambridge. And if someone asked me, what's the best way to reach Godmanchester? And I say, well, if it's rush hour, I would suggest you go that way. If it's the morning, or if it's early enough, or if it's during the middle of the day, then you could probably go this way and you'll be fine. My point being, there are different ways to get to Godmanchester, and all of them are relative. If you fancy a walk, you could walk it. If you want to get fit, you could cycle it. If you want to, or run there. If you want to go shopping, I would suggest taking a car, and so on and so on. The point is, if you want to do X, then you should do Y. That's a relative value. So that's the road that you would go down if you wanted to get somewhere. Contrast that with a road that everyone has to go down no matter what. And the closest I could come to was Route 66, which is the road on the coast in California, whereas people say, oh, you have to drive Route 66. I think, unfortunately, everyone has, and that's kind of ruined it, actually, but whatever. It's an analogy. My point here is, imagine that there was a road that if someone said, which road should I go to get to? And can I stop you there? Go down there. And I said, no, I haven't told you where I want to go yet. I said, no, go down there. It doesn't matter where you want to go. You have to go down that road. Imagine if I told someone that. What I would essentially be saying is there's an absolute value to going down that road. It's not about where you want to go. I don't care where you're interested in ending up. The point is you will be better off going down this road no matter what. So there is a difference between relative value and absolute value. And the really interesting thing about this is that Dawkins is making a similar mistake to Fraser in two respects. One, he's misreading what the student is saying. If you actually watch the video, and I will share it, if you watch the video that Dawkins engages with the student, you will see that Dawkins gets the things wrong. The student says something, and Dawkins says something completely different as what he just said. They're not at all the same. He's deliberately misreading what's going on, just like Fraser misunderstood the rain dance. The other reason it's similar is Dawkins is actually doing the same thing as the child. The boy is saying, I absolutely believe this, rather than I relatively believe this. What I mean is, he's saying, I believe the Quran not because of something, but just because it's a necessity to do so. It's absolutely true, not it's true if I want to achieve something. Dawkins believes in evolution because it's a good way to explain life in all of its diversity on the planet Earth, right? Evolution is a very powerful and effective theory. Religion is not a theory. It's not a hypothesis. It's not offered as an explanation for something. When it is, it's wrong. And on that, I agree with Dawkins. When it's a trivial explanation of what happens to happen in the world, it is not religion, in my view. And again, you can disagree with me on that for all sorts of reasons. This is not, something I'm proving. This is just something I hope you'll go along with me on, this idea that really what we want to get from religion is something absolute. And by the way, there are interesting scientists who have understood this. Isaac Asimov, the famous science fiction writer, Isaac Asimov, who had written books on every topic. If you go to a library, there isn't a section in the Dewey Decimal System where you can't find a book by Isaac Asimov. He was one of the most prolific authors ever. He wrote a book on every subject. Isaac Asimov said, if you want something absolute, you have to ask a priest. No scientist can ever be absolute. So for instance, no scientist can say water boils at 100 degrees no matter what. Because of course it's not no matter what. It depends on your altitude. It depends on your, whether there's salt in the water, whether it's pure water, whether it's actual H2O or not. You'll find that very rarely actually does water boil at 100 degrees at all. Often you'll have to go to 102 degrees or 98 degrees and it will still boil. The point being, there are no absolutes in science, but there are absolutes in religion. In fact, arguably there are only absolutes in religion. And Dawkins was saying, Isaac Asimov was saying that if you want an absolute, go to a priest. But then he said, if you want something useful, go to a scientist. And what do we mean by useful? Well, I've got some headphones here. They've got microphones built in. A priest is not going to make those for me. A priest is not going to tell me how to make a better cup of coffee. Better according to what? Well, better according to a relative sense. But a priest can tell me you absolutely cannot drink coffee. Just ban it. Could do. They don't, but they could. Maybe in some religions they do. But remember the point that Wittgenstein made about him saying that religion says, do this, think like that. And that's its strength, not its weakness. Although it is also its weakness. Because again, it can't be useful. It's just absolutely true. So the point is, Dawkins fundamentally misunderstands what's going on here. And I have never, ever heard Dawkins talk about this, ever. And I've read his books, I've seen him talk. He does not talk about this because he doesn't understand it. I argue that that video between Dawkins and the 15-year-old boy, the 15-year-old boy wins. The 15-year-old boy wins that debate. Why? Because the 15-year-old boy understands relative value, relative truth, and he also understands absolute truth. Dawkins only understands relative truth. However, Dawkins does express absolute truth, and that's the second reason why he's like James Fraser. Because just as James Fraser misunderstood a celebration as a causal explanation, so too does Dawkins misunderstand an absolute truth for a relative truth, but he does it because of his own absolute truth. What I mean by that is, if we go back to the quote from before, where Dawkins said, religion teaches them to accept authority, good, because that was the point I just made, revelation and faith, instead of always insisting on evidence. I guarantee you Richard Dawkins himself does not do that. I guarantee you he does not always insist on evidence. If he is told by someone, oh, you should take an umbrella with you, he doesn't say, what's your evidence? He just takes the umbrella, especially if he lives in Britain because it rains all the time here. My point is, he doesn't always insist on evidence, but even if he did, that would be an absolute. That's not scientific. There are scientific situations in which you cannot rely on evidence. There is none, or it's unreliable, in which case you can't do anything. By the way, I mentioned that technology is one example of how science can be useful. Okay, but did you know that science doesn't actually know how my phone works? The 3 nanometer chips that are used in technology today, they actually rely on quantum entanglement. They rely on quantum physics to work. And scientists don't know how quantum physics works. They just know that it does work. They don't know how, but they know that it does. They have no evidence. Essentially, it's a kind of faith. So my point here is simply, even scientists believe something absolute. Let me try that video one more time. No. Okay. So my point here is that Dawkins does the very thing that he rejects, which is believe in absolutes. And here is Wittgenstein talking about exactly this theme. He says, so Wittgenstein's lecture on ethics, he talks about 3 experiences, which I've mentioned to you in some way. So one is wondering why there is a world at all. One is the feeling of perfect safety. And I think the other is a feeling of wretchedness or of being wrong somehow, being fundamentally wrong. And he says these are uniquely religious experiences. Anyway, it's not essential to understand the point, but he says the 3 experiences which I have mentioned to you, and I could have added others, seem to those who experience them, for instance, to me, because he had experiences of those, to have in some sense an intrinsic absolute value. They're not valuable because they do something. They're valuable in and of themselves. So that's what the intrinsic bit is. And they're absolute because they're not better or worse than other experiences. They are experiences that everyone should have. Everyone should feel perfectly safe, but they can't. Not everyone can. But when you do experience it, you understand it's not like relative safety, like sitting at the front of the bus is safer than sitting at the back of the bus. The point of absolute safety is I'm safe no matter what happens. So even if the bus crashes, even if I'm horribly injured, even if terrible things happen to me, it's okay. It's okay for that to happen. That's the feeling of absolute, perfect safety. But he says, but when I say they are experiences, surely they are facts. They have taken place then and there. For instance, I mentioned that he experienced the feeling of perfect safety because he visited what he called a mediocre play. So he visited a mediocre play and had this feeling of perfect safety. So they took place in a place. It took place in Vienna in 1914. That's when he had that experience. So I know this because I've read his biography, but he would know this because it happened to him at a particular time in a particular place. So he says, surely these are facts. They've lasted a certain definite time, and consequently they're describable. You can give a false or a true description of what happened. And so from what I have said some minutes ago, I must admit it is nonsense to say that they have absolute value, because surely they're made mundane by the fact that they existed. Remember my distinction between trivial and meaningful, between relative and absolute. Notice here what he's saying. So for instance, the eternal significance of numbers or of God precludes their existing, because if they existed, they'd exist like coffee exists or hamsters exist, right? Wittgenstein is saying, but surely these things exist too. My experience of God, the experience of numbers, the use of numbers, these exist at a certain time. Numbers were invented, right? I said before, we didn't make numbers up. Of course we did, right? We made numbers up. The number zero didn't exist until the 14th century, implying that there was no zero century, right? Or year zero. So we don't actually know how old Jesus was, because we don't actually know when they started counting. Did they start counting at 0 or did they start counting at 1? We don't know. Doesn't matter. Ultimately, I don't think it makes a huge amount of difference. But the point I'm making is numbers did come into existence. In Europe, for instance, in the West, we count with our fingers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? So we have a 10 decimal system, hence why we have decimal points. We have 0.1 up to 1.0. So everything is divided into tens. In Mesopotamia, so in Persia, they counted the joints on their fingers. And by counting the joints on their fingers, they could count to a much higher number. And I used to think they didn't count the thumb, but apparently they did. So they went 1, 2, and then they would count their thumb using their little finger like that. So they could count their, but anyway, the point is they had a different counting system. So their numbers were different, but it's still true to say that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Just for them, it might be 3 plus 3 equals 8. Within their mathematical system, that would make sense. My point is, what is true about numbers is always true, but they did come into existence and they are, in some sense, worldly. We made them happen. And Wittgenstein says, I will make my point still more acute by saying it is the paradox that an experience, a fact, should seem to have supernatural value. These things happened in nature. Facts are natural. Naturalism basically means only natural things exist, but it also essentially means the world is purely factual. And Wittgenstein is trying to say the world isn't purely factual, and yet I suppose it's reducible to something factual, because absolute value is still experienced as a fact by certain people. So we have this paradox that he wants to respond to. I will explain why this is relevant in a moment. It does become more relevant. So Wittgenstein says he meets this paradox by challenging this kind of scientific view of the world, and we'll talk more about scientism next time. But for now, it's enough to say that what's missing between Dawkins and the student is not fact. That the student even says to Dawkins, I fully understand the fact that you've understood around science. I understand the value of scientific fact. But he says his reading of his Quran, his reading of his holy text, where he finds the right things. Again, it's not dependent upon facts. Rather, his religious beliefs determine what count as a fact. And again, like I said, Dawkins does this too. He also determines what counts as a fact. He says if it has evidence, then it's factual. Right? So he is making a claim about what counts as a fact, and he's doing it on the basis of what I would call scientism, not science, but scientism. And again, I will talk more about this next time. But my point here, and I'll try and sort of distill what I'm trying to get, because this is difficult. What Wittgenstein is saying is that there is a distinction to be drawn between relative things and absolute things. One example of this we'll come to in a moment is miracles, right? If a plane crashes and one person survives, we'll say that was a miracle. And what we mean is it's just very unlikely. Of course, it's not impossible that one person should survive an accident. It's entirely possible. Everyone could have survived, so why couldn't one person survive? Also, one person survived. Okay, it makes it unlikely. It's miraculous. He's not denying that it's miraculous, but he's saying it's miraculous in a relative sense. Miraculous in an absolute sense would be to say, why was I born? Why does anything exist? Why is there a world to experience? Why is there anything at all rather than nothing? And that is what he's talking about as a kind of absolute sense of things. And that is not answered by these relative issues. Going back to a point I made before, I said, if I wonder why the sky is blue, and someone tells me it's because water vapor causes light to refract at a certain frequency that my human eye reads as blue. Notice this is a Dawkins-like explanation, right? Dawkins loves these facts, and that's very factual. So let's say I ask, why is the sky blue? And Richard Dawkins answers me. He tells me the very reason why the sky is blue. My wonder goes away. I wonder, and now I don't wonder. Richard Dawkins, however, completely misses the possibility, though, that someone might say, I wonder why there's a sky at all. Or I wonder why the facts that we have are the facts that we have. Why don't we have different facts? And that is not a wonder that can go away, because no one can explain that. If someone said, oh, it's gravity of the earth bringing vapor and gases towards the earth, that's what creates the sky. I'll say, okay, but why did that happen? I'm asking you, why is there something happening rather than nothing happening? And so any explanation that is offered within that something gives me nothing. Notice again, we've got to go outside of space and time to explain the meaning of space and time. To understand why my life is meaningful, I have to go outside. I can't just say, oh, well, my mum and dad got together and then I was born. That doesn't give my life meaning. It's just a fact, and it's true for everyone anyway. It's trivial. It's mundane. It doesn't give my life meaning. It's not what makes it meaningful. So again, things that are relative cannot give one's life meaning. Dawkins, therefore, presumably doesn't have meaning in his life, but he does, because of course for him, science is meaningful. Going back to that quote from earlier, he says, the wonderful explanations that science provides, wonderful. He thinks these are a miracle in themselves. Einstein expressed this view. He said, the most miraculous thing about the universe is that we can explain it, is that it makes sense. E equals mc squared is beautiful. It's a beautiful piece of science. I mean, why should it be so simple? And of course, it could be false. But of course, it looks beautifully simple. The energy and matter relate to each other through a constant, which happens to be the speed of light. Light, by the way, which is both matter and energy. Oh, it's beautiful. It's wonderful. It just really hits you as this meaningful, profound. That's what Dawkins is talking about. That's what he thinks gives his life meaning. Unfortunately, he's doing it, what's the word, cynically. He's doing it in a way where he wants to reject other people's ways of doing that and wants to insist that his absolute is the only absolute. And I will talk about more about scientism next time, where I'm going to argue that scientism is actually the worst kind of absolute. And I can actually, which is a dubious thing to say, but what I'm saying is religious views make sense if they're used to give life meaning. They are not very interesting if they're used to explain the world. Science is the reverse. Science is a wonderful tool for explaining the world, but gives no meaning to our lives whatsoever. So I would argue that it's the better position to be in is to have both science and religion in your life. Okay. For some reason, I did finish my slides, but for some reason they haven't updated. I apologize. I'm not sure why that is. I'll make sure I get the updated slides to you for next time. So the last argument I want to look at is an argument by a philosopher called Alvin Plantinga. And he wants to argue that naturalism, which remember we've talked about a couple of times, came up in relation to Dawkins. I've tried to sort of connect all these different objections together. Plantinga wants to argue that it's not science that's that conflicts with religion. It's naturalism which conflicts with science. This is a very interesting claim. He says there is superficial conflict, but deep concord, agreement between science and religion. I would argue the same. Any disagreements between science and religion, to me, are superficial. They're not proper disagreements at all. I think science and religion are doing completely different things for very important reasons, meaning theology gave rise to science precisely because theology didn't need science anymore. It didn't need to be a tool for explaining the world. It was now a tool for giving life meaning. And I think that's always what it was meant to be, and that's always what its original intent was. So actually, I very much like that first bit. But interestingly, he then goes on to say, there is superficial agreement, but deep conflict between science and naturalism. And that is strange, because what he seems to be saying there is science cannot be held consistently with the view of supernaturalism. Science cannot be held consistently with naturalism, meaning science requires something supernatural. Because naturalism, remember, is the view that only natural things exist, nothing supernatural exists, which is a silly position. It makes no sense, but let's go with it. We haven't got time to get into that problem. We'll just focus on this. But his point, his argument, and I'm going to put this very simply, Alvin Plantinga's point is that if you're a scientist and you believe that there's only nature, then the problem is that every claim you make is relative. Remember my point about saying Dawkins only understands relative value, relative truth? All truths in science are relative, meaning E equals mc squared is true if we understand E in relation to M, in relation to C, in relation to T, in relation to all these other, momentum and all the, basically the scientific systems that we create are a way of making sense of the world. If they do it accurately, great, but you could have come up with another system that also accurately captured the world. They would do the same job, but they would be different systems. But also, crucially, the fact that the world is the way it is isn't guaranteed. It doesn't have to be this way. Perhaps one way of bringing this out is to say how contingent science is. So for instance, electrons, no one has ever seen one, and probably no one ever will. No one knows that electrons exist, but electrons are a really useful way of explaining how electricity works, and electricity works. So let's keep electrons. So my point is, electrons aren't a thing like a table is a thing. And even the table, we could argue, is made up of atoms, which are mostly nothing but nothing, right? Atoms are tiny, tiny points of charge separated by actually relatively large distances. This is why gas and liquids can exist, right? Because the atoms move further apart, the molecules move further apart, and that leaves space for a gas to exist or for liquids to exist, but they can also be turned into a solid if you push them closer together. So tables feel solid, but actually they're mostly made out of nothing. They're just quite closely packed atoms, but even the atoms themselves are mostly nothing. Anyways, my point is, the relative nature of science means that everything in science is uncertain. I said, didn't I, just a moment ago, that Isaac Asimov made the point that if you want absolutes, you have to go to a priest. You will never find an absolute in science anywhere. If you do, you're talking to the wrong scientist. There is nothing absolutely certain in science at all, except the fact that there's nothing certain. So the point I'm making here is to say that, or rather the point that Plantinga is making, is that if you embrace naturalism, you have to embrace the idea that all claims, everything you believe, is relatively the case. And that leaves you with absolutely no certainty. This is difficult, but this is the way I would normally explain it to people. I would say, imagine there's a closed system, a circle, and everything in the circle makes sense to everything within that circle. The only reason you can make sense of the circle is because you can see the other side of the circle. You can see outside the circle, right? The only reason that you can say, oh, all those things are within the circle is because you can step outside the circle or you can see the boundary of the circle. If you're in the circle yourself, which we are, right? If we're part of nature too, then we never get outside of the circle. We don't know what the boundary is. We don't know what the line is that's drawn outside it. Meaning, we have absolutely no reason to believe that the beliefs that we have are true. Let me give you a perfectly plausible and entirely possible explanation for what is happening to you right now. You all think you're sitting watching me on your phones or on your tablet or on your computers, listening to me give a lecture on philosophy. What if I told you that the truth is you're a little flatworm and you live in a puddle and you need a certain enzyme to stay alive? And the way in which you release that enzyme is by imagining that you're a person who has a history and a family and a life and that attends philosophy lectures. That explanation I just gave fully accords with the facts. Alvin Plantinga says there is absolutely nothing you can do to disprove that. So what he says is, if we arrived here by accident, as a series of accidents that have no reason to happen, right? If science is just the unfolding of a series of accidents, then why would anything we believe be true? It could all just be accidentally believed. We could just believe what we think is true accidentally. That's what I mean by everything is relative to the system, and therefore everything is uncertain. You can't get any belief. Science cannot deliver a belief at all, because all it can say is, this happens to be what I think the world looks like. But of course, you could be wrong, and you could never know. You could never believe anything with anything close to certainty. You cannot believe that evolution is true, for instance, because you are a kind of thing that might have evolved to think that evolution is true. Or you might have been created to think that evolution is true. You might be a computer program designed to think that evolution is true. This is all terrible philosophy, by the way. I don't like this kind of philosophy. But I like the idea of what Plantinga's going for is this idea that science hasn't delivered us anything but a series of facts. And from a series of facts alone, you cannot derive anything true, nothing certain, no true belief. You need something supernatural to do that. And what Plantinga is essentially explaining is this is why Dawkins is a scientimist, or rather, this is why Dawkins is susceptible to scientism, because Dawkins needs something supernatural, namely the wondrous correctness of science, to be true in order to justify his belief in all the different scientific theories that he believes in. If he was a true scientist and didn't embrace scientism, then he wouldn't be able to believe anything, because he would just be able to say, well, you know, I hold beliefs because I'm the kind of being that holds beliefs, but I'm probably wrong. There's a million ways in which I could be wrong, and only one way in which is that I'm that one in a million. The example I gave of the flatworm, for instance, that's just one example of what would explain your experiences right now. There are a billion different explanations for why you're experiencing what you're experiencing now, and only one of them has to be true. But what are the chances that you're one in a billion, right? What are the chances that your one experience of the world accords with how the world actually is? So Plantinga says, in order to believe anything is true of the world, we have to believe that there is something outside of nature, outside of science, that vouches for it, that confirms it as true. There has to be something outside of the system itself to explain the system itself. And that is a really powerful argument, much better than anything Dawkins has come up with. Plantinga is a phenomenally good philosopher, but I really want to find the flaw because I really don't like what Plantinga is arguing. So I want to argue that Wittgenstein's lecture on ethics offers us a way to supplant Plantinga, to show why Plantinga is wrong. So in the lecture on ethics, Wittgenstein states, when we say this man's life was valuable, I made this point earlier. I said, if we think of someone's life as valuable, their soul, so to speak, we don't think of it as valuable in the same way that we think of jewelry as valuable. So this man's life was valuable doesn't mean in the same sense in which we would speak of valuable jewelry. There is some sort of analogy there, but it's not a strong analogy and it's not the same thing. What he means is the jewelry is given value by us, right? Why do we find gold valuable? It's quite good as a conductor. It looks pretty, I guess. It's quite rare, but there are rarer elements. There are more useful elements. I would argue carbon is a lot more useful than gold. Carbon makes me, right? I'm a carbon-based life form. I love carbon. Carbon's great, but carbon isn't as valuable as gold because it's not as rare. But then there are other rarer things as well. So my point is, I mean, for instance, I could say, why is my left hand not valuable? Because there's only one left hand that belongs to me. Someone could wear that around their neck. No, don't do that. Don't do that. But my point is, jewelry is given value by us. If it has a value, it's an artificial value that's relative to other things. How do we know this? I can put a price on it. How much is that ring worth? £800. There you go. I've given it a value. So it has a value. And if I said, if it was a bit better quality, or if it was a bit more gold in it, or if it had a diamond added, you could add another £600. But all of that value is relative. If you ask me to put a price on a person's life, whatever number I give you is literally just pulled out of thin air. A person's life could be worth 1p, $1. It could be worth $1 billion. It could be worth 2 trillion. It could be worth an infinite amount of money, all the money on the earth. It could be worth no money at all. The point is, we have no idea. So we give value to jewelry, but the value of a person is simply given. It's a given, as in it's a given that 2 + 2 = 4. I didn't make that true. So where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is to say that Plantinga's appeal to the supernatural to avoid the relativism of scientific claims is very similar to a supremely valuable item used to underwrite the relative valuable things. So what I mean is this. Plantinga's argument that we need something outside of nature to explain nature is a little bit like saying we need to know what the most valuable object in the world is in order to understand the value of any object. And firstly, we don't. And secondly, that's not how we determine the distinction between a value of a thing and a person. So my point is, the less preferable the more preferable option, the better option here would be not to appeal to another supremely valuable thing, but to apply to an absolute value. What I mean by that is it doesn't have to be outside of nature. It could be intrinsic to nature. The value that we're talking about doesn't have to be found outside of space and time in the sense of another thing that doesn't exist within nature. It doesn't have to be something supernatural. It could just be the value that we attribute to nature, period. What I mean by it is like gold is a part of nature, just like my left hand is a part of nature, just as a leaf from a tree is a part of nature. But they don't all have equal value because we don't ascribe them equal value. But insofar as they are valuable in and of themselves, that we could say is true. Right? A leaf has as much value intrinsically as gold does, intrinsically, because it's as much itself as the gold is. It's as much a part of the world that we cherish as any other part of the world that we cherish. So what the point I'm saying is that there is a kind of parallel going on in Plantinga's argument that's similar to Wittgenstein's arguments in his early philosophy. We covered this in our first session, where I talked about him saying the world is the totality of facts. But he said, but even if you gave a complete account of all of those facts, you wouldn't get anything of value. But he said something has to come in from outside, but it's not supernatural. It's me. It's my perspective that gives value to these things. It's my ability to come to the world and see facts. So nothing of value could be found in the world except by me through the world. So my point is, Plantinga's appeal to something supernatural is erroneous. What he needs to appeal to is something non-natural, something value-laden as opposed to factual. So Dawkins wants to appeal to only facts, and that's where he becomes kind of impoverished. But he then finds value in those facts, which I think is wrong because I think it misreads what the facts are. But the young boy that he was debating, he finds value in the world through his own values, through his absolute set of values, and he applies those to the facts as he finds them. So the facts for everyone are the same. The values that we determine to determine what counts as a fact, that comes from us. And we aren't supernatural. We are part of nature, but we are that part of nature which can comprehend itself. So this is all very deep philosophy, and I apologize for that. But all I'm saying is this is how Wittgenstein unravels many of these debates. I think in every single case, and I know that some of you have missed the first series of problems that I was looking at, but in every single case, in all of the examples of the problems we've been looking at, Wittgenstein has cut through them in a very specific kind of way. Wittgenstein has found a way through these problems that doesn't so much side with one side over the other. It just breaks through and shatters the whole paradigm. So should we believe that God exists, or should we believe that God does not exist? Wittgenstein says existence is irrelevant. Abandon any claims of it, because numbers don't exist, but that doesn't make numbers less true. So what I'm getting at is that's one example of how Wittgenstein solves the debate. The other way in which Wittgenstein solves the question around immortality, for instance, which was the second problem I looked at, people saying, why does it matter if my soul continues on? Wittgenstein says, he's right, it doesn't. There's no religious significance to the idea of my soul continuing, because if the soul isn't me, then who cares? And if it is me, then what's all this stuff here? Why have I got arms and legs? Why is that me? So the point is, it's either me continuing or it's not me continuing. If it's me continuing, so what? I'm continuing right now. It doesn't mean that I have meaning in my life. Budala, go ahead. Did you want to unmute and come in there? I noticed your hand is raised. You're muted though. Did you want to? Okay. I'll assume that the hand went up by mistake. Okay. So Wittgenstein's solution to this question of immortality is to say there aren't any answers that come from having more life, but why can't we view our lives as more than they are? I.e., why can't my more life come right now, as Luke suggests in the Gospel, right? Where I quoted this passage from Luke's Gospel where he says, heaven isn't a place you find. It's not a time or place. It's not a thing you discover. It's not another continent or another country or another place. It's not a holiday which you go on after you die. It's to be found right now, here and now. And this is what Wittgenstein seems to be expressing. So I would argue there is a kind of historical veracity to what Wittgenstein is saying. There's this kind of truth to what Wittgenstein is saying that expresses where these religions came from, what they were really intended for, which is to say, to giving our lives absolute value, not relative value. A longer life is longer than another life. That's relative. But any life can be absolutely valuable, no matter how long it is, because it's absolutely valuable. It's not, its value doesn't depend upon having more. So this is the point I'm trying to make about why an appeal to relative value, even to a supremely valuable thing, right? Like to living forever. It's not just more life, it's the most life you can have. That doesn't help. That doesn't make my life meaningful. In fact, it might make my life even more trivial because each moment now becomes a total kind of transient, trivial kind of puff. It's just puff. It's just each moment. So if I read a book, if I live forever, I'm going to read that same book 1 billion times more. In fact, 100 billion times more. In fact, 1 trillion times more. Even if I try and actively avoid reading it, I'm going to end up reading it because I've got forever. And if it's not me living a life, reading books and so on, speaking with people, laughing, telling jokes, shopping, eating, sleeping, if I'm not doing any of that stuff, then it's not life. So again, what value comes from having it? None. So imagine if someone said to you, oh, you were alive before you were born. Your soul was just in limbo, waiting for you to have a life. Would it make your life now more meaningful if you said, oh, I had an eternity before now, and now I've got this short life to live? So why would it be more meaningful to say, I've got a short life followed by an eternity? Why is that helpful? So again, Wittgenstein's point is to cut through these assumptions that we make about what religious beliefs mean, and to point out that religious beliefs might have a deeper meaning, even if you yourself don't know what it is, but really believe it yourself. What Wittgenstein is, these are practices that we have practiced for thousands of years. Thousands of years ago, people believed the same things we believe today, but have we misinterpreted them today? The rain dance, like I said before, could be performed today by people who think that they're dancing in order to make it rain. And then they read Wittgenstein and go, oh no, of course, we do it in October. Maybe we're doing it to celebrate the rain. That's the profundity of what Wittgenstein is doing in his philosophy. And again, you can fundamentally disagree with what he's doing, but I would argue that he is still delivering a distinction between a trivial belief in superstitious faith and an absolute meaningful belief in what makes our lives profound, important, meaningful, absolutely valuable, and so on. So I said that I had this rather funny joke to Aaron last week where I said, Alvin Plantinga's book is called Science versus Religion, or Naturalism versus Religion, something like that, where the conflict really lies. And I said, what I want to change it to is to where the lies really conflict. Because I want to argue that Plantinga is wrong, that in some ways he's onto something meaningful, that he's onto something right. I really like Plantinga. He's a great philosopher, but he's still wrong. And he's wrong because he wants to say that science and religion are conceptually consistent, and that I agree with. But he wants to say that science is somehow made worse by naturalism. And I want to argue that, firstly, naturalism doesn't mean anything. I want to argue that the problem is that naturalism is more a kind of superstitious belief. The idea that one day science will explain everything. It's a superstitious element of science. Science cannot and need not make any such absolutist claim. And I would argue its strength, like I said before, religion's strength is that it says, do this, think like that. And it cannot offer justifications for it. Budala, we're getting writing on the screen, I think, from your finger. Apologies. Let me disable annotation. But again, if you want to unmute, you're currently muted. If you want to ask a question, please do. You're welcome to. So religion has absolutes, and that's its strength. Science, I've argued, has relative positions, and those are its strengths. It is a good thing that science is purely relative, but that means it can't possibly give our life meaning. So the two areas are separate. I talked to you last time about Wittgensteinian fideism and said, this is what we're accused of. We're accused of separating science and religion. In this sense, I want to separate science and religion. I want to say science is never about absolute claims and religion is never about relative claims. But of course, they overlap. And this is why Wittgenstein said there's a kind of paradox that gets created, because we want to say that religion takes place in the world. It takes place here and now. It takes place, in a time, in our lives. So surely it's a fact. We can describe it. But I want to say, no, that's a mistake. That it's easy to see that mistake. And it's easy for Richard Dawkins, for instance, to think that science is absolutely true. But those slips that we're making, we just need to correct them. And each time we correct them, we get back to something closer to an understanding of why there is no conflict here. There is no distinction here. There is only a conflict when we mistakenly think that science can deliver absolutes, or when we think that religion can tell us facts about what lies under a particular rock, or how old something is, or what books we should read or shouldn't read. Those are claims that are, if they're contingent, I mean, there are certainly books that you must read, but if you said something like, there are books that are bad for your spiritual health, I'm sorry, there's no such thing as spiritual health, because you're making a scientific claim there, I assume. There is such a thing as spiritual truth. There might be such a thing as spiritualism, but spiritual health, have I lost my spiritual kidney? Is that something? Anyway, so my point is, the blurring of the distinction between them is the problem. Sharpening that distinction helps a lot, but that's not to say the two don't conflict with each other or don't bounce off each other. They absolutely do. But when they do, it shouldn't be because we've made them do it. Anyway, so my point nonetheless is that insofar as religion is religious, it deals with absolute claims. Insofar as science is scientific, it deals with relative claims. Next time, we're going to look at how science often makes these absolutist claims and why it's wrong to do so. One final problem, not sure what's happened with the picture. One final problem we wanted to talk about was the problem of evil. And I wanted to talk about it partly because it relates to Plantinga, because Alvin Plantinga is credited with having solved the logical problem of evil. The logical problem being, God is omnipotent, God is all-loving, evil exists. Those three logical claims, those three statements can't all be true. That's the claim anyway, that's the argument that's made. Sometimes people have to add other premises, for instance, a loving God would destroy evil, that kind of thing. So there are other ways of framing the problem, but in basic form, that's what the logical problem is. And Alvin Plantinga solved the logical problem by saying, a loving God would want us to have freedom, and freedom requires us to make mistakes. Sadly, of course, that doesn't explain natural evil. It only explains human beings being evil, but it nonetheless has solved, in some respect, the logical problem of evil. But it also left in existence the evidential problem and the existential problems of evil. So, for instance, a religious person could lose their faith because of an evil they experience. Job comes very close, in fact, arguably does lose his faith at a particular point. He regains it, but because he also regains his, doesn't matter. Let's not harp on about Job again. But Job loses his faith because of the evils that he experiences, and that is possible. And that's why there's an existential problem of evil. Can I maintain my faith in the face of the evidence or in the face of my own existence? Well, my old professor, D.Z. Phillips, who is a Wittgensteinian, you won't be surprised to hear, he wrote a book called The Problem of Evil and the Problem of God. The cover was the image that was on here. I don't know why it's vanished, but D.Z. Phillips developed this argument that the logical problem, the reason that we get into these difficulties, like arguing about the existence of God, like arguing about the existence of an afterlife, like arguing about all the things that we've talked about so far, whether God exists or doesn't exist, whether there's possible worlds where God can exist, all these sorts of things that we've talked about, all of these are misguided. And that once you impose a fully Wittgensteinian perspective on these problems, you start to see them as they should be seen. So, for instance, taking just the first claim in the logical problem of evil, which is that God is omnipotent. God can do anything logically possible. God can turn water into wine. God can turn time backwards, although Jews don't think that he can. Jews say that God can't do anything logically impossible, and turning time back is logically impossible. So Jews actually argue you can't ask God to turn back time. But anyway, but God could make 2 + 2 = 5, maybe, or maybe not, because that's not logically possible either. But God could make me kill my wife, is one example that D.Z. Phillips considered. He said, could God make me kill my wife? And he said, this is just the fundamentally mistaken way in which we think about God and think about the attributes of God. So just as existence is a nonsensical term, he says, so too is omnipotence. So what the point is, we're looking at these ideas, we're thinking and not looking. Remember our second session on Wittgenstein's method, which is to look, not think. Well, this leads us to a position of non-apology. What that means is non-apologetics is an approach to the problem of evil that says we don't have a problem to answer, because we only think there's a problem if we think that omnipotence is relativistic. meaning God is more powerful than any other being that we can possibly imagine. But if we instead think of God's omnipotence not as relative, but as absolute, meaning he's impervious, he's complete, but he's also indifferent. On this view, God couldn't ride a bike or eat an ice cream because that's absurd. If you said God rides a bike, could God ride a bike badly then? Presumably he could. Well, that doesn't sound particularly omnipotent to me though. God can eat an ice cream. With what? How? Why? But all of these things sort of raise absurdities. God's omnipotence lies in his not having these capacities or these limitations. Eating an ice cream is a limitation, not a power. Riding a bike, we see it as a power because not being able to ride a bike seems worse than being able to ride a bike. But to God, those things are utterly nonsensical capacities. It'd be like if I said, can the number 8 ride a bike? Again, going back to the number analogy, it's just absurd to propose that God could ride a bike. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what we're talking about when we talk about the nature of God. And this indicates a solution to the problem of evil, which is this non-apologetic approach. Diogenes Allen, who writes beautifully on this subject, he's also someone who reads Simone Weil, like I do. He's a wonderful Weilian, but he died a while ago. But Diogenes Allen said, to love God, not despite suffering, but because of it. So imagine this idea that we love, loving God despite suffering is relative. It means that we can lose our faith through suffering. But if you love God because you suffer, then you can't lose it. You can't lose that faith. It's an absolute faith. It's a rock. So which is the stronger here? Which is the more powerful? And notice here, this is not then saying God creates my suffering. God makes me suffer. It's I love God because I suffer and because I have God, not because he makes me suffer. So this is relating directly to Wittgenstein's claim that the answers to the problems of space and time lie outside space and time. It's this idea that God's absolute nature means that he wouldn't, it would be to tarnish God to make him trivial in riding a bike, to make him mundane by eating an ice cream. To make God an existing thing is to make him like a chair or an apple or a hamster. It's to make him something that exists. Likewise, Chesterton and his appeal in his introduction to the book of Job to avoiding the solutions of man, right? This has been my whole shtick the whole way through this session. I've been saying, forget the solutions of man, the solutions of philosophers who say, God doesn't exist. I mean, imagine if someone had said that to Job. Would that have made Job feel any better? No, it wouldn't have given him any value to his life to be told, oh, you're suffering, but don't worry, there's no God. So Chesterton says the riddles of God are more satisfying than the solutions of man. And I hold to that. And that's what Wittgenstein, I think, discloses, is this riddles of God. The fact that we can love God not despite suffering, but because of it, feels like a riddle. It challenges us, but it's not logically impossible. Diogenes Allen himself embodied this. He had awful cancer. He had the terrible pain throughout his life or for a long period of his life. And what he used to do was just intone one thing, the Greek word for endure, which was hupomone. He just used to say hupomone. His mother taught him this. And what he would do is read Simone Weil. He would understand that what she was saying was, in experiencing that awful suffering, or rather affliction, as she calls it, one is stripped of all these pretensions, all these expectations that you'll be treated well by God, that prayer is in order to benefit myself, or that I'll get an afterlife if I behave myself. If I do good, then God won't blow me to oblivion. Remember all of these different stories that we've been telling where people will say, okay, well then go ahead and blast. Strike me down now if the reason for not striking me down is because I'm acting the way you want me to be. So again, the justifications for religion are what make it look ugly. And this often happens in the problem of evil discussions. What my professor, D.Z. Phillips, used to say, that discussions of the problem of evil very rarely justify evil. Far more often, they contribute to it. I'll give you one example. John Hick, the theologian, said, the reason why we suffer is the same reason that we go to the dentist. You may not like it, but it's good for you. By suffering, we learn. That is the most disgusting thing I've ever heard anyone say. I don't care if he's religious or he's not religious. It's a vile thing to say. Why? A child's leukemia teaches them something? Nah, get lost. You get nothing from that, nothing. And what if they're a baby and they're suffering awfully and then they die? What fool would say the baby has learned something? To which you might respond, oh, but the parents do. Oh, right. So the parents now benefit from their child's pain. I don't think that the parents want that. I don't think they would find that a particularly appealing religion. However, if you now say God had nothing to do with it except in your response through suffering, you can respond through a love of God. You can love God because of suffering, not despite it. That is a profound religious message. That is something that has almost converted me. I would say it has converted me. I'm not religious myself, partly because, like I said, I face problems like their philosophical, like their religious problems. But my philosophy perhaps prevents me from engaging fully with religion. But that's a religion I can get on board with. That's one I found profound. And it's also one I think Richard Dawkins could get on board with. It's one that I think Cormac McCarthy could get on board with. These are very famous atheists. It's one that Anthony Flew, unfortunately, probably should have embraced rather than his other kind of faith. Anyway, I hope this session's been interesting. I know that that I might have touched upon some of the problems which you'd be familiar with, but I know that not all of the problems I've talked about today were problems that you probably concerned you in the past. But we do have a little bit of time for questions. If anyone has a question they would like to ask. What was that, sorry? Oh, okay. I'm not sure that was aimed at me. Did anyone have any questions before we finish? Okay, feel free to use the chat as well. If you'd rather just write your questions, you're welcome to do so in there as well. I'll stop sharing. I haven't yet put the slides in the folder because those aren't the right slides. I'll do it right now though with my other device. But we've got a good 5 minutes yet. So if people wanted to ask any questions, feel free. Okay, well, if there's no questions, I'm not seeing anything appearing in the chat, then what I will do is I'll end the call and hopefully see you all next time. Thank you everyone who's turned up. I know that some people arrived late. I don't know if there's been a sort of time change or anything like that, but yeah, we'll be at the same time next week. So hopefully catch you then as well. And if not, I will make sure it's recorded just like we've recorded this session as well. Okay, thanks everyone. Take care.